In this quick tutorial, we are going to check out how to set up a supercharger. First step, let's set up a bog standard engine, an inline-4, 2 liter, everything standard, in pretty modern times. To not get bogged down by various engine stresses, let's go for all forged internals. Also, make sure that your base engine is naturally aspirated, and that you are not using any kind of fancy fuel. You should be arriving at something like this. An engine that is running basically stress-free, doesn't make much power, and is running way too little compression. The most handy feature to tune your engines will be the 4-way graph mode, which you find up there. Here we see that we do have some octane left over. It is all green. And we are preparing the engine to take a supercharger by just sliding down the compression till it is mostly blue. Also, don't forget to open up your exhaust so that it is below the 50% mark at the highest RPM, just so that we don't run into any flow limitations while tuning. You can do a little bit of the same for the header, as well as the manifold. And now we're ready. Let's put on a supercharger. The game automatically tries to give you something somewhat reasonable for the size that you have selected. But be aware that this is mostly only for modern engines. As a rule of thumb, you will be looking for half the capacity of your engine as the size for your supercharger. The very modern ones will be about at 40% of the capacity of your engine. The gear ratio of the supercharger is basically the pulley ratio. It is how much the crank rotation speed is getting amplified to your supercharger. If the crank makes a full rotation, the supercharger will make 2 full rotations with this setting. Modern superchargers rev up to about 18,000 to 24,000 RPM. While old ones, like really old ones, will be about 6,000 to 8,000 RPM if you're lucky. The larger the supercharger is, the lower will be its maximum revs. The setup that was given to us by default here in this instance is pretty solid. It is not exceptionally well set up, and we're not making a lot of boost, but it is working, and that is the first important thing. But how do you determine if something is set up right or wrong? Well, first of all, we have to take a look at the compressor map of the supercharger. And this is for a positive displacement supercharger. Positive displacement superchargers are roots type as well as screw type superchargers. Ideally, you will want to use the entirety of your map, of your compressor map, for your engine setup, unless it becomes way too inefficient out here. But how do you do this? Well, it's quite simple. The supercharger pulley ratio or total gear ratio is what is influencing how much amplification you get from your supercharger. In one combustion cycle, the supercharger will pump twice this amount of air into the engine times this amount. Depending on how much air the engine actually takes, that is what builds the pressure. If you provide more air, the pressure will build up, but at the same time as you build more pressure, the engine will use more of that air because more flows into the engine. To make the best use of this map, we can play around with the supercharger gear ratio. So as I increase it, you will see that now we are spooling earlier. Well, it's not spooling, that's for turbos, but we are going on full boost earlier, as well as we are now getting into a mechanical stress level that is not very healthy for this supercharger. So let's reduce it down. This is looking pretty happy now at 2.3. We are on full boost starting at 1,900 RPM. The map colors are showing you the efficiency of the supercharger. Here it is peaking at 70%, which is decent, and you will see lots and lots worse stats in that regard for earlier ones in the early years. The lower the efficiency, the hotter the air that comes out of it, and the more power it needs to compress that air. If you want to know how much power is being lost, taken from the crank, in order to compress that air to drive the supercharger, you can have a look at the little mu up here, which is showing you the effective friction that is sapped from the engine. In this case, about 40 Newton meters, quite significant that. Increasing the size of the supercharger has a similar effect to increasing the overall pulley ratio. If we make it bigger, something like this, you will see that yes, you will get power earlier on, but also you will see that we are now using more power to drive it. The opposite is true if we make it smaller. So we are going to lose a little bit of the low-end performance, but overall the performance will be higher. The maximum output will be higher because now we are driving a smaller compressor. And we are losing less to having the boost limit there, because if we just open up this, you will see the natural progression of that supercharger. You can of course just set it to a boost limit of nothing, of everything, and just let it run naturally. That will mean that you will never have any kind of losses that don't also give you a fair amount of additional power. If you, however, want to control the torque that your engine produces, this is the way to do it. As we decrease this, you see how it flattens out that curve and limits the power up on top. This comes in handy if you're using bottom-end components that can't quite handle the amount of torque that you're producing. Let's say we are settling for something of 0.7 bars of boost. We are using the smaller size to not be too wasteful, to not have too much friction. We can expand the gear ratio a little bit, and that is looking excellent. Now, what do we need to do to fully tune the engine? Well, quite simple, just the normal stuff. First, let's increase compression until we see some yellow up there. That is looking a lot better. Now we're going for the flows. This intercooler size might be a little on the big side, but as you also can see, it is quite drastically influencing the flow that we experience through the engine. So let's keep it somewhere there. Now, on the fuel system, we do have the manifold size. We can decrease it again. We want to be somewhere around the 100% mark at the top. The same goes for the header size. And finally, the exhaust. And there you have it. Let's look at this thing. Yeah, looks about right.